January 26, 1945. The Holtzwihr Woods, near Colmar, France. The ambient temperature hovered at 14 degrees Fahrenheit, a bone-deep chill that turned the muddy ground into iron-hard ruts and froze the breath in men's lungs before they could even exhale. The sky was a relentless, oppressive sheet of slate grey, offering no warmth and, more importantly to the men on the ground, no air support. Under the canopy of the darkened trees, the remnants of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, shivered in their foxholes. They were exhausted, depleted, and dangerously exposed. The air did not smell of pine or winter crispness. It reeked of cordite, wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of looming violence. Emerging from the tree line across the frozen field, the enemy materialized like a mechanical nightmare. 6 German panzer tanks, their tracks churning the icy earth with a terrifying rhythmic clanking, led the assault. Behind them, clad in white snow camouflage that made them look like ghosts against the drifts, marched 250 hardened German infantrymen. The ground trembled under the weight of the armor. The sound was a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in the teeth of the Americans waiting in their shallow pits. Against this mechanized onslaught, the American forces had virtually nothing. Their own armor support, consisting of 2 M10 tank destroyers, was rapidly disintegrating under the precision fire of the German 88mm guns. One of the M10 seconds took a direct hit. The armor-piercing shell slammed into the thin plating of the destroyer, igniting the fuel and ammunition stored within. The vehicle didn't just catch fire. It became a geyser of flame and black smoke, a death trap that the crew scrambled to escape. The order to withdraw was given. It was the only logical military decision. To stay was suicide. To retreat meant surrendering the woods, but saving the lives of the surviving men. The soldiers of Company B, battered and demoralized, began to pull back deeper into the forest, dragging their wounded, their eyes wide with the terror of being overrun by heavy armor. But one man did not retreat. He was a lieutenant who stood barely 5 feet, 5 inches tall, weighing 112 pounds, a stature that seemed almost comical against the backdrop of total war. His face, still retaining the softness of youth, looked more like that of a high school student than a company commander. Audie Murphy ordered his men to fall back to the safety of the trees while he remained at the forward command post, a field telephone clutched in his gloved hand. The artillery barrage from the Germans intensified, churning the earth around him, sending geysers of frozen dirt and shrapnel into the air. With the enemy tanks closing in, now less than 50 yards away, Murphy did the unthinkable. He did not dig in, he did not run. He climbed up the steel hull of the burning M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle was a ticking time bomb, loaded with gasoline and explosives that could detonate at any second. The heat radiating from the burning chassis was intense enough to singe eyebrows, yet Murphy mounted the turret. He grabbed the handles of the 50-caliber Browning machine gun mounted on top, swiveled the heavy barrel toward the advancing wall of white-clad German infantry, and opened fire. For the next hour, the impossible unfolded. A single, diminutive figure, silhouetted against the flames of his own dying war machine, held off an entire German company. The 50-caliber machine gun roared, its rhythmic thumping drowning out the shouts of the enemy. Murphy was exposed, a perfect target standing atop a burning beacon, yet he moved with a mechanical precision, cutting down wave after wave of infantry, forcing the tanks to hold back for fear of losing their infantry support. He was calling in artillery strikes over the field telephone with one hand while firing with the other, bringing American shells down so close to his own position that the concussion waves rattled his teeth. He was not merely a soldier in that moment. He was a force of nature, a singular point of resistance that defied physics, logic, and the instinct for self-preservation. This moment in the frozen fields of France was the crescendo of a military career that baffled statisticians and thrilled historians. But to understand the man on the burning tank, we must leave the smoke of Colmar and travel back to the dust of Texas. The story of Audie Murphy does not begin with glory. It begins with a desperate struggle for basic survival that predates his military service. Born on June 20th, 1925, in Kingston, Texas, Audie Leon Murphy entered a world that seemed determined to crush him. He was the 7th of 12 children born to poor sharecroppers, Emmett and Josie Bell Murphy. The economic devastation of the Great Depression did not merely graze the Murphy family, it engulfed them. They lived in a dilapidated house with no electricity, no plumbing, and often no food. The landscape of his childhood was one of relentless, grinding poverty, where the primary objective of each day was simply to find enough calories to endure until the next. His father, Emmett, was a man defeated by circumstance, drifting in and out of the family's life before abandoning them entirely in 1940. This abandonment left Audie, then only a teenager, as the primary breadwinner for a sprawling family. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade to pick cotton for $1 a day, his small hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, his back aching under the brutal Texas Sunday. But it was in the scrub brush and fields surrounding their shack that Murphy began to develop the specific set of skills that would later define his lethality in Europe. Ammunition was a luxury the family could scarcely afford. When Audie went hunting for rabbits or squirrels to put meat in the stew pot, he was given a single, .22 caliber round. A miss meant no dinner. This binary reality, hit or starve, forged a marksman of terrifying precision. He learned to stalk his prey with the silence of a ghost, to read the wind, to control his breathing until his heart rate slowed, and to fire only when the outcome was a mathematical certainty. He did not hunt for sport, he hunted for survival. This high-stakes environment rewired his nervous system. He learned to function under the pressure of consequence, a trait that is impossible to simulate in basic training. The tragedy that hardened his resolve occurred in 1941, when his mother, the center of his emotional world, died of endocarditis and pneumonia. Her death shattered the family. The younger children were sent to an orphanage, and Audie was left with a burning, directionless rage and a need to escape. When the news of the Pearl Harbor attack crackled over the radio in December of that year, Murphy saw his exit strategy. He saw a chance to be something other than a poor sharecropper's son. He attempted to enlist immediately, but the military bureaucracy was less than impressed with the boy standing before them. At the time, Audie Murphy stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed barely 110 pounds. He looked frail, malnourished, and entirely unsuited for the rigors of combat. The Marine Corps, looking for physically imposing shock troops, rejected him outright. The paratroopers, who required men capable of carrying heavy loads upon landing, laughed him out of the recruiting office. The Navy, too, saw no use for him. It was only the U.S. Army, desperate for bodies to feed the growing war machine, that finally accepted him in June 1942, and even then, only after his sister helped him falsify his birth date to appear 18. His arrival at Camp Walters, Texas for basic training was met with skepticism and ridicule. His drill sergeants, looking at his slight frame, nicknamed him Baby. During marches, he struggled to stay upright under the weight of a standard infantry pack, which often weighed nearly half as much as he did. Seeing him stagger under the load, his superiors attempted to have him transferred to a role as a cook or a baker, believing he physically could not withstand the demands of the infantry. Murphy, however, refused. His stubbornness was absolute. He insisted on combat training. While he lacked physical mass, he possessed a terrifying endurance and agility. On the obstacle course, he was fluid and fast, and when they finally put a rifle in his hands at the range, the laughter stopped. The sharecropper's son, who hunted to eat, drilled the center of the target with a consistency that silenced the entire platoon. He wasn't just a good shot, he was a natural extension of the weapon. The transition from the dusty training grounds of Texas to the Mediterranean theater of war was a journey into the abyss. Murphy was assigned to Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. He landed in Casablanca in early 1943, but saw no immediate combat. It was a period of waiting, of drilling, and of acclimating to the reality of army life. But when the invasion of Sicily began in July 1943, the baby of the platoon would undergo a rapid and violent maturation. His first encounters with the enemy revealed a tactical mind that operated on a different frequency than his peers. Murphy understood instinctively that his size, previously a liability, was his greatest camouflage. He could move through culverts, dense brush, and rocky terrain that would snag a larger man. He learned to use the landscape, merging with it rather than imposing himself upon it. In Sicily, he killed his first enemy soldiers, 2 Italian officers escaping on horseback, with a precision that surprised even him. But it was also in these early campaigns that he contracted malaria, a disease that would plague him with fevers and shakes for the rest of the war, adding yet another layer of physical torment to his daily existence. As the 3rd Infantry Division pushed through Sicily and onto the Italian mainland, invading at Salerno, and later enduring the hellscape of Anzio, Murphy began to accumulate a reputation. He was no longer the mascot of the unit, he was becoming its lethal point of the spear. The war in Italy was a grinder, a series of brutal assaults against entrenched German positions in mountainous terrain. It was here that Murphy's specific style of warfare began to crystallize a blend of hunter-gatherer patience and aggressive, calculated violence. He rose through the ranks not by political maneuvering, but by attrition and competence. As officers and sergeants around him were killed or wounded, Murphy stepped into the voids, assuming command naturally, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle with a strange, calm authority. To fully appreciate the anomaly of Audie Murphy's success, one must engage in a deep technical analysis of the equipment, tactics, and physical dynamics that defined his war. The standard issue rifle for the American infantryman was the M1 Garand, a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle weighing nearly 10 pounds when loaded. For a man of Murphy's build, the Garand was heavy, cumbersome, and difficult to maneuver quickly in close quarters. While he was an expert with it, Murphy frequently favored the M1 carbine. We must understand the specifications of this weapon to understand Murphy's effectiveness. The M1 carbine weighed only 5.8 pounds. It fired a .30 caliber cartridge that was less powerful than the Garand's 30-06, but it had a 15-round detachable magazine compared to the Garand's 8-round N-block clip. For a soldier like Murphy, who relied on speed, flanking maneuvers, and rapid fire suppression, the carbine was the superior tool. It allowed him to move faster than his enemies anticipated. He could sprint, dive, and roll with the carbine in a way that would be clumsy with a full-sized battle rifle. This weight differential is not a trivial detail. Over a 10-mile march or a 3-hour firefight, the energy saved by carrying a lighter weapon translated directly into combat effectiveness. Furthermore, Murphy's tactical application of the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun, the weapon he would later use to legendary effect, requires technical scrutiny. The Mardeus, as it was known, is a heavy, recoil-operated machine gun capable of firing between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. The projectile it fires is massive, capable of punching through engine blocks, brick walls, and light armor. The recoil forces generated by this weapon are significant. Typically, it is fired from a tripod or a vehicle mounted by a soldier bracing himself against the tremors. At Holtzwihr, when Murphy mounted the burning tank destroyer, he was dealing with a weapon system that was not designed for a lone operator in such precarious conditions. The tank destroyer was on fire, which meant the structural integrity of the metal was compromised, and the ammunition stored inside the hull was heating up toward its flashpoint. Murphy had to stand on the wet, slippery steel surface. The M2 on the tank mount allowed for a certain degree of traverse and elevation, but to effectively engage infantry and suppress them, Murphy had to manipulate the heavy gun constantly. He wasn't just spraying bullets, he was conducting a symphony of suppression. The ballistic advantage of the 50 caliber round provided Murphy with a psychological weapon as well as a physical one. When a German infantryman takes cover behind a tree or a wooden fence against standard rifle fire, he feels relatively safe. The 50 caliber round, however, turns that cover into splinters. It ignores light cover. This terrified the German infantry. They were being engaged by a weapon that denied them the basic safety of the battlefield. Murphy understood this. He used the weapon to strip away their confidence, forcing them to ground, paralyzing their advance. Moreover, we must analyze the integration of artillery in Murphy's tactics. During the Holtzwihr engagement, Murphy was not just a gunman. He was a forward observer. He held a field telephone connected by wire to the artillery direction center miles away. This required a split consciousness. One part of his brain was engaged in the immediate, visceral act of killing enemy soldiers with a machine gun. The other part was visualizing a map, calculating coordinates, estimating distances, and relaying corrections to the battery. This is a cognitive load that overwhelms most soldiers in training environments, let alone while standing on a burning bomb. He called for time on target, barrages or danger, close fire missions. In a danger close mission, the artillery shells are calculated to land within 600 meters of the observer's position. Murphy was calling them in much closer, essentially inviting the destruction to his own doorstep. The technical proficiency required to adjust artillery fire, drop 5-0, right 2-0, while under direct fire from tanks and infantry indicates a mind capable of extreme compartmentalization. He was solving geometry problems while staring death in the face. Another critical technical aspect was his exploitation of the German Panther tank's limitations. The Panther was a formidable beast, with sloped frontal armor and a high-velocity 75mm gun. However, in the tight confines of the woods and the icy terrain, the tanks were blind and sluggish. They relied on their infantry to protect their flanks and identify targets. By stripping away the infantry with his machine gun fire, Murphy rendered the tanks vulnerable and hesitant. A tank without infantry support in a wooded environment is a blind giant. Murphy knew this. He targeted the eyes and ears of the German armor, halting their advance not by destroying the tanks himself, but by removing the tactical ecosystem they required to operate. We must also consider the physiological anomaly of Murphy's resilience. Suffering from chronic malaria, he was often fighting with a fever. Malaria causes anemia, fatigue, and muscle pain. Yet, his adrenaline response seemed to override these deficits. During the invasion of southern France, specifically near Ramatuelle, Murphy's best friend, Laddie Tipton, was killed. Tipton had raised his head from cover when a German soldier feigned surrender, waving a white flag, only to shoot Tipton dead. This violation of the rules of war triggered a neurological shift in Murphy. Witnesses described him entering a state of black fury. This was not a chaotic, flailing anger, but a cold, hyper-focused state of predatory aggression. He picked up a German MG-42 machine gun, a weapon that fires at a terrifying 1,200 rounds per minute, and advanced alone against the fortified German position. The MG-42 is heavy and notoriously difficult to fire from the hip due to its recoil, yet Murphy did exactly that. He assaulted the position, killing the men who had tricked his friend, and then systematically cleared the area. This event suggests that Murphy possessed a psychological trigger where extreme emotional trauma was converted instantly into tactical lethality, bypassing the paralyzing grief that would incapacitate others. The impact of Audie Murphy on the European theatre was not merely statistical, though the numbers are staggering. He is credited with killing over 240 enemy soldiers, wounding and capturing many more. But the true impact lies in the specific human stories that radiated from his actions. The men of Company B, the dog faces who served alongside him, viewed him with a mixture of awe and protective affection. To them, he was not a superhero. He was the reason they were still alive. There is a poignant account from a private who served under Murphy in the Vosges Mountains. The unit was pinned down, morale was breaking, and the men were freezing. Murphy, despite his rank as a lieutenant, moved among them, checking their feet for trench foot, sharing his meager rations, and speaking in that soft, flat Texas drawl that promised them they would make it home. He led from the front, a dangerous philosophy for an officer, but the only one Murphy understood. He would never ask a man to go where he would not go first. This created a bond of loyalty that was unbreakable. When he ordered a retreat or an advance, his men obeyed instantly, not out of fear of court-martial, but out of the absolute belief that Murphy saw a path to survival that they could not. The cost of this heroism, however, was etched into his body and soul. Murphy was wounded 3 times. The most severe was a sniper's bullet that shattered his hip in the final months of the war. The recovery was grueling, gangrene set in, and he nearly lost the leg. He lay in a hospital bed, weighing barely remains of his former self, while the war ground to a halt. It was during this convalescence that the full weight of what he had done, and what he had lost, began to settle upon him. When the Medal of Honor was draped around his neck, making him the most decorated soldier in American history, Murphy felt a profound disconnect. He was 20 years old, he had no education, no trade, and no family to return to. He had traded his youth for a collection of ribbons. The iconic photograph of Murphy on the cover of Life magazine shows a fresh-faced boy with slicked-back hair and a uniform heavy with brass, but the eyes tell a different story. They are the eyes of an old man, guarded, detached, and haunted. This was the 1,000-yard stare, documented by combat photographers, the visible symptom of a soul that has seen too much destruction to ever fully reintegrate into the mundane world. Post-war life for Murphy was a complex battlefield of its own. He was thrust into the limelight, hailed as a conqueror, yet he carried the invisible wounds of what was then called battle fatigue, and what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from insomnia that was absolute and tormenting. When he did sleep, he was plagued by nightmares of the burning tank, the faces of the men he killed, and the friends he couldn't save. He slept with a loaded M1000 911 pistol under his pillow, a habit he could never break. The sound of a car backfiring would send him diving for cover. He was a national treasure who was terrified of the dark. His entry into Hollywood was another strange chapter in a surreal life. James Cagney, the legendary actor, saw the Life magazine cover and invited Murphy to California. The idea was to capitalize on his fame, but Murphy wanted to be taken seriously. He struggled for years in minor roles, taking acting lessons, trying to learn a trade that was diametrically opposed to his nature. Acting requires emotional vulnerability. Survival in war requires emotional armor. Eventually, he found success in westerns, a genre that suited his quiet demeanor and his natural skill with a horse and a gun. But the most surreal moment of his film career came in 1955, with the release of To Hell and Back, the movie based on his autobiography. In a twist of meta-narrative that is almost unique in cinema history, Audie Murphy played himself. He reenacted his own trauma for the cameras. He charged the German positions again, climbed the burning tank again, and watched his friends die again, this time on a soundstage with pyrotechnics. One can only imagine the psychological toll of reliving the worst moments of one's life, take after take, for the entertainment of an audience. Yet, he did it with a professionalism that earned him critical acclaim. The film was a massive box office success, holding the record as Universal Studios' highest-grossing film for 20 years until the release of Jaws. Murphy used his fame for a purpose greater than vanity. He became one of the first public figures to speak openly about the psychological cost of war. In an era where admitting to mental struggle was seen as weakness, Murphy broke the taboo. He spoke about his nightmares, his dependency on sleeping pills, and his volatile temper. He advocated for better treatment for veterans, particularly those returning from the Korean War and later, Vietnam. He tried to tell the American public that you cannot train a man to be a killing machine, drop him back into civilian life, and expect him to function like a faulty appliance that just needs to be unplugged. The reflective conclusion of Audie Murphy's life is as tragic as it is heroic. He survived the impossible odds of the Colmar Pocket, the malaria of Sicily, and the snipers of Anzio, only to die in a plane crash on a foggy mountain in Virginia. It was May 28, 1971. Murphy was a passenger on a private Aero Commander 680 Super. The weather was poor, rain and fog obscuring the pilot's vision. The plane slammed into the side of Brush Mountain near Roanoke. Murphy was 45 years old. The irony is palpable. The man who had walked through storms of steel and fire, who had defied the calculated ballistics of thousands of German soldiers, was taken by a mundane navigational error in peacetime. His body was recovered and buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave is the second most visited site in the cemetery, surpassed only by President John F. Kennedy. The headstone is standard government issue, indistinguishable from the thousands of others surrounding it, except for the gold lettering that lists the impossible number of decorations he received. When we synthesize the life of Audie Murphy, we are left with a complex legacy that transcends the medals and the movies. He challenges our archetypes of heroism. We are conditioned to believe that warriors are giants, men of imposing physical stature who dominate through strength. Murphy shattered this illusion. He proved that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is the human will. He demonstrated that lethality is a function of precision, speed, and tactical intelligence, not muscle mass. But beyond the tactical lessons, Murphy leaves us with a profound ethical reflection on the nature of service. He was a man who gave everything to a country that initially rejected him. He served not for glory, he often gave his medals away to children or relatives, but because he felt a crushing sense of responsibility to the men on his left and right. His story forces us to confront the reality of what we ask of our soldiers. We ask them to endure the unendurable, to suspend their humanity in order to protect ours, and then we ask them to return and be normal. Murphy never returned to normal. He carried the war with him every day until the mountain took him. His legacy is found not just in the history books that detail the Battle of Holzwar, but in the ongoing conversation about how we treat those who return from battle. He showed us that the most decorated soldier was also a fragile human being, capable of great violence and great vulnerability. Today, as we look back at the grainy footage of the Second World War, among the roaring tanks and the marching columns, we should look for the small shadow moving through the trees, the little man who cast a giant shadow. Audie Murphy remains the ultimate testament to the American spirit of grit and determination, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. And in the freezing woods of France, on a burning tank destroyer, he decided that the lives of his men were more important than his own. That is the definition of valor. That is the story of the little man who became a giant. Let us return to the analysis of the European theatre to understand the magnitude of the environment Murphy operated within. To truly grasp the scale of the obstacle Murphy faced at Holzwar, we must zoom out to the strategic situation of late 1944 and early 1945. The Colmar Pocket was not just a localized skirmish. It was a festering wound in the Allied lines. It was a bridgehead held by the German 19th Army on the west bank of the Rhine River. As long as the Germans held this pocket, they threatened the flank of the entire Allied advance into Germany. The winter of 1944–45 was historically brutal. It was the winter of the Battle of the Bulge, a time when the German war machine, though dying, thrashed with the desperate, lethal energy of a cornered animal. The terrain of the Alsace region, where Colmar is located, is a nightmare for offensive operations in winter. It is a flat plain situated between the Vosges Mountains and the Rhine. In January, the ground is a frozen table, offering little natural cover. The forests are dense patches of darkness in a sea of white snow. For an infantryman, this meant that to move was to be seen. The German defenders had months to prepare kill zones. They had pre-sighted their artillery on every crossroads, every bridge, and every clearing. When Murphy and the 3rd Infantry Division were ordered to clear the Colmar Pocket, they were being asked to walk into a pre-arranged slaughter. We must delve deeper into the psychology of the German soldier at this stage of the war. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht was a mix of fanatical SS units, hardened veterans, and hastily conscripted old men and boys. However, the units facing Murphy in the Holzwar woods were not the scrapings of the barrel. They were competent, dangerous combatants equipped with the best armor Germany had left. The Jagdpanther tank destroyers and the Panther tanks were technically superior to almost anything the Allies could field. The Panther's 75mm cannon had a higher muzzle velocity than the Allied 76mm guns, meaning it could kill American armor at ranges where the Americans could only scratch the German paint. This technical disparity highlights the insanity of Murphy's stand. He wasn't just outmanned, he was technologically outclassed. The M10 tank destroyer he climbed upon was a destroyer, in name only when facing a Panther head-on. The M10 had an open turret, exposing the crew to shrapnel and sniper fire. Its armor was thin, designed for speed, not for slugging matches. When Murphy climbed that burning hull, he was standing on a vehicle that had already failed its primary purpose. He was repurposing a wreck into a stationary fortress. Let us expand on the sniper duel aspect of Murphy's skill set, which he honed in the woods of France. Sniper warfare is a distinct subset of infantry combat. It is a chess game, played with bullets. It requires an understanding of human psychology as much as ballistics. Murphy knew that men are creatures of habit. They take the same paths. They peek over the same logs. In the Vosges Mountains, before the Colmar incident, Murphy engaged in a terrifying game of cat and mouse with a German sniper who had been terrorizing his company. The German sniper was hiding in a camouflaged position, picking off men who exposed themselves. Murphy ordered his men to stay down. He then began to crawl. He crawled for hours, inch by inch, through the wet undergrowth. He didn't look for the man. He looked for the signs of the man. A disturbed branch, a glint of glass, the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel against the organic chaos of the forest. Finally, Murphy spotted a momentary movement. He didn't fire immediately. He waited. He waited for the German to become confident, to shift his weight. When the shot came, it was a single round from Murphy's carbine. The German fell. This wasn't just a kill. It was a message to his own men that the invisible monsters in the woods could be slain. It reinforced the legend that Murphy could see things others couldn't. We should also consider the logistical nightmare that underpinned these battles. The Red Ball Express and the Allied supply chains were stretched to the breaking point. By the time supplies reached Murphy's unit in the Colmar Pocket, they were often critically low on ammunition, winter clothing, and medical supplies. The trench foot, mentioned earlier, was a medical crisis of strategic proportions. Trench foot is caused by prolonged exposure to damp, cold, and unsanitary conditions. The feet become numb, turn blue or red, and eventually the tissue dies. Gangrene sets in. Amputation follows. Murphy's insistence on checking his men's feet wasn't just maternal care. It was a tactical necessity. A soldier who cannot walk cannot fight. By forcing his men to change socks, by massaging their frozen feet, Murphy was preserving his unit's combat effectiveness just as surely as if he were cleaning their rifles. Let's look closer at the specific mechanics of the Medal of Honor action at Holtzwihr regarding the radio communications. The field telephone Murphy used was a primitive device by modern standards. It relied on a physical wire that had to be spooled out from the rear. If that wire was cut by shrapnel, which happened constantly, communications died. Murphy, in the midst of the firefight, had to ensure that the wire remained intact. At one point, the line went dead. Murphy, amidst the exploding shells, had to find the break and repair it. This detail is often lost in the cinematic retelling, but it is crucial. It shows that his heroism wasn't a single moment of madness, but a sustained effort of problem-solving under fire. Furthermore, when he called in the artillery, "Danger close," the artillery officers on the other end of the line initially refused the order. They told him it was too close, that he would kill himself. Murphy's response was curt and terrified. "I'm holding the line. Fire the mission." He had to override the safety protocols of his own support network. He had to convince men miles away to drop high explosives on his own coordinates. The trust the artillerymen had to have in Murphy's voice that he knew what he was doing, that he wasn't panicking, was absolute. If he had been screaming hysterically, they might have hesitated. But Murphy's voice on the radio was described as cold. The aftermath of Holtzwihr also deserves a more granular examination. When the German attack finally broke, when the tanks reversed and the infantry fled, Murphy didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He slumped on the turret of the burning tank, exhausted. He was covered in soot and blood, some his own, some from the men who had died earlier. He limped back to his men, who were looking at him as if he were a ghost. The first thing he did was not to boast, but to organize a counterattack. He realized the Germans were retreating and disorganized. Despite his fatigue, he led his men forward, reclaiming the ground they had lost. They pushed the Germans back out of the woods entirely. This is the mark of the professional, the ability to exploit a victory immediately, even when the body is screaming for rest. Let's return to the rejection phase of his life to explore the sociological context of the 1930s military. The U.S. military in 1941 was a small, underfunded institution rapidly trying to expand. The physical standards were rigid because they were based on World War I doctrines. The assumption was that a soldier needed mass to endure the physical collision of trench warfare. They wanted linebackers. They didn't understand that the coming war would be one of mobility, of small unit tactics, where a smaller target was harder to hit. Murphy was a victim of outdated thinking. The irony is that his deficiencies were actually adaptations. His small size meant he required fewer calories to function a massive advantage when supply lines were cut. He could fit into foxholes that larger men couldn't, offering him better protection. In the cramped interior of an armored personnel carrier or a transport plane, He took up less space. But the most critical adaptation was his poverty. He was used to discomfort. He had slept on dirt floors. He had gone days without eating. The hardships of the front line, which broke the spirits of men from affluent backgrounds who were used to soft beds and 3 meals a day, were familiar territory for Murphy. He had been training for the misery of war his entire life. He just didn't know it. We must also expand on his post-war advocacy. Murphy was not just a passive sufferer of PTSD, he was an active fighter against the bureaucracy that ignored it. In the 1950s and 60s, the Veterans Administration was woefully ill-equipped to deal with mental health. The prevailing attitude was, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Murphy used his political capital to lobby for research. He spoke to congressmen. He used his fame to open doors. He understood that he was the exception. He had money and fame to cushion his fall. But he knew thousands of boys from Texas, Ohio, and New York were rotting in VA hospitals or in prisons, unable to cope with the demons he knew so well. His gambling habit is another facet of this trauma response that warrants discussion. Murphy became a notorious gambler, betting large sums on horses and cards. Psychologically, this makes sense. For a man who had survived the ultimate gamble, betting his life against a German tank company, ordinary life lacked intensity. The rush of risking money was a pale substitute for the rush of combat, but it was the only legal high available. He won and lost fortunes. It was a manifestation of a dopamine system that had been permanently altered by the extreme highs and lows of Mortal Kombat. He was chasing the dragon of adrenaline that the war had injected into his veins. Also, his relationship with the Hollywood studio system reveals the exploitation of the war hero. Universal Studios saw him as a commodity. They didn't nurture his acting talent initially. They marketed his medal. They put him in B movies, low-budget westerns where the plot was secondary to the poster. Murphy was intelligent enough to see this. He resented being a prop. He worked hard to improve his craft, eventually earning respect from peers who initially dismissed him as a stunt casting. He wrote poetry and country songs, revealing a sensitive, artistic interior that clashed with his public image as a killer. He was a man of contradictions, a poet who killed, a hero who felt like a coward, a star who wanted to be invisible. Let us look at the weapon systems of the enemy in greater detail to understand the threat density. The German MG-42, which Murphy faced constantly, was known as Hitler's buzzsaw. Its sound was unique, not a rat-tat-tat, but a continuous tearing sound like ripping canvas. It fired so fast that individual shots were indistinguishable. Psychologically, this sound was devastating. It suppressed the urge to move. To advance against an MG-42 required a suppression of the survival instinct that is almost contrary to biology. Murphy didn't just face this weapon. He hunted it. He treated machine gun nests as puzzles to be solved, flanking them, distracting them, and destroying them. And what of the German 88? The 88mm flak gun was originally an anti-aircraft weapon, but the Germans discovered it was a devastating anti-tank and anti-personnel weapon. Its high velocity meant that the shell arrived before the sound of the gun firing. There was no warning. One moment you were walking, the next you were dead. The airburst shells were particularly gruesome, timed to detonate above the ground, raining jagged steel down into foxholes. Murphy survived barrages of these weapons in Italy and France. The luck involved is statistical madness, but Murphy created his own luck by constantly moving, never staying in a pattern, never letting the enemy fix his position. There is a story from the Anzio beachhead that illustrates his leadership style. A new replacement officer, a 90-day wonder, fresh from officer candidate school, arrived at the front. He began barking orders, trying to assert authority over the veteran platoon. The men ignored him, looking to Murphy instead. Murphy quietly took the officer aside. He didn't berate him. He told him, "Lieutenant, if you want to live, you listen to Sergeant so-and-so. He knows where the mines are. You worry about the map. Let us worry about the fighting." He bridged the gap between the brass and the grunt. He was an interpreter of violence. Reflecting on the cultural impact, we must consider how Murphy changed the archetype of the American male. Before the war, the ideal was John Wayne, big, swaggering, invincible. Murphy was the antithesis. He was the boy next door. He proved that the capacity for violence and heroism was democratized. It wasn't reserved for the giants. It was accessible to the sharecropper, the clerk, the little man. This resonated deeply with the American public. They saw their own sons in him. He wasn't a god. He was one of them. The specific details of his injuries are also telling. The hip wound he suffered left him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. He was in constant physical discomfort for the last 25 years of his life. Yet, in his movies, he hid it. He performed stunts. He rode horses. He projected an image of physical wholeness while his body was a wreck. This duality, the public projection of strength versus the private reality of pain, is the essential theme of his post-war life. Let's revisit the Colmar Pocket one last time to visualize the sensory experience of the M10 firing. The .50 caliber machine gun is loud, but the explosion of a tank shell is deafening. The M10 Murphy was standing on was burning. The ammunition inside 76mm shells was cooking off. This means the propellant inside the brass casings was igniting due to the heat. When this happens, the tank doesn't just explode once, it shudders with internal explosions. Murphy was riding a bucking bronco of detonating ordnance. The concussive force of the blasts would have been punching him in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. The smoke was choking him. His eyes would have been streaming tears from the acrid fumes. Yet, he kept firing. The sensory overload was total. Most men would go into the fetal position. Murphy went into the attack. His legacy is also tied to the specific unit he served with the 3rd Infantry Division, the Rock of the Marne. They suffered higher casualties than almost any other division in the European theatre. Murphy was one of the few originals to survive from North Africa to Germany. He watched an entire generation of young men die around him. He was a survivor of a lost tribe. This survivor's guilt is a heavy burden. He often asked, "Why me? Why did I live when better men died?" This question has no answer, and the lack of an answer tormented him. In the final analysis, the story of Audie Murphy is a warning against the simplification of war. We like to wrap war in flags and anthems, to make it neat and heroic. Murphy's story, if you look closely, is messy. It is full of blood, mud, sickness, trauma, and pain. His heroism wasn't a shiny badge. It was a desperate, dirty, necessary act of survival. He showed that the human spirit is capable of transcending almost any physical limitation, but he also showed that the cost of that transcendence is paid in pieces of the soul. When the text-to-speech voice reads these words, let the pauses be heavy. Let the silence between the sentences carry the weight of the 240 men he killed and the friends he buried. Audie Murphy was the most decorated soldier in US history, yes, but he was also a casualty of the war. Long before his plane hit that mountain, he was a sacrifice on the altar of freedom, a small man who carried the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders until they finally, mercifully, gave out. To conclude, let us look at the numbers one final time, not as statistics but as markers of endurance. 33 awards and decorations, 3 Purple Hearts, the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with V device. Each piece of metal represented a moment where he stared into the abyss and didn't blink. Each ribbon was a brush with death. He collected them not for vanity, but as receipts for the price he paid. And the price was everything.